site do evento, né, brasilenergyfrontiers.com.br. Então, a partir de sexta-feira. Então, todas as apresentações estarão disponíveis. Hoje, até o final da tarde, se já não estiver disponível, os anais do evento, das apresentações, dos trabalhos técnicos que nós veremos, já estarão disponíveis também no site do evento. Então, os senhores poderão obter os anais dos artigos que foram apresentados para o Congresso no site do evento também, não no site do Instituto, mas no site do evento. Dentro do site do Instituto, do lado esquerdo, na parte inferior, tem um link para o site do Brasil Energy Frontiers. E o último aviso, vocês já receberam sobre a mesa uma reunião da Associação Internacional de Hidrelétricas, do IHA, International Hydropower Association, que será hoje à tarde, às 5h30, após o encerramento da conferência. Será aqui numa sala em frente. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado, Alexandre. Ficam aí os avisos, então. A qualquer instante nós faremos aquele sorteio do mini iPad e o mesmo bilhete, o mesmo papelzinho enumerado que está nas suas mãos para o sorteio de hoje, vale também para o sorteio de amanhã. Então, por favor, não joguem-o fora, tragam amanhã também. Bom, boa tarde a todos, sejam bem-vindos novamente. Temos o prazer de receber o professor Hugh Rudnick, ele que é da Pontificia Universidade Católica de Chile, para proferir aqui a palestra magna. O Rudnick é engenheiro eletrotécnico civil pela Universidade de Chile, e mestre em ciências e doutor em filosofia pela Universidade Victoria de Manchester, Grã-Bretanha. O Hugh Rudnick é professor emérito da Faculdade de Engenharia da PUC do Chile e ele tem contribuído como pesquisador e consultor para os processos de desregulamentação do setor elétrico da América Latina e do gás. O Dr. Rudnick comanda a Sistep, uma empresa de consultoria altamente especializada na área de estudos técnicos e econômicos do setor de energia. Então, por favor, vamos receber, senhoras e senhores, Rudnick. Fique à vontade, aqui nós temos o passador, para frente, para trás e o laser.
Boa tarde, muito obrigado. To be giving a Magna lecture sounds a bit pompous. I'll just give a lecture. Essentially, I will try to share with you my views of what are the challenges for the energy industry, particularly the power sector worldwide, and particularly in South America. Let me start by saying that I am wearing two hats here, as mentioned in the introduction. One is a professor at the Catholic University in Santiago, one of the most reputed universities in the region. Actually, if you look at the QS rankings, it is first University of Sao Paulo, second Catholic University of Chile, then Buenos Aires University, UNICAM, and University of Chile. We have over 26,000 students, and we are a private university funded partially by the government. My other hat is I'm a consultant. I am a director of Sistep, a consultancy company in power markets. We do work in electricity markets and regulation, planning and electrical studies, and market intelligence. Many investors, as you see there, that come to Chile, come to us for us to help them to get involved in the country. What are the takeaways that I would like you to bring home from today? Let me get my watch. Essentially, I want to share with you what are the... Okay, thank you. What are the challenges arising from a wide range of alternative technical developments that are taking place worldwide. I want to warn you that there is a danger, a threat of destruction of the traditional utility business model, and I will explain why. And of course, very much of this base because of the global adoption of renewable energies, essentially solar and wind, because of distributed generation growing, because of demand having new roles, storage coming as a new tool for system operation and expansion. I will share with you a discussion about the traditional expansion of transmission being somehow questioned. Should we look for alternatives or not? I will also share some common subjects, some problems that you're having in using gas in a hydroelectrical market. Brazil and Chile similarly. I will talk about the gas electricity dependence. And finally, not least, the social challenges. At the end, if we don't have the social approval of what we are doing in our investments, we will not be able to pursue our activities. Most of this talk will be based on a recent edition of the Power and Energy magazine, where I was the guest editor. This was published this July, and it shares worldwide experiences of the challenges I will be mentioning. And I will be talking about the UK, I will be talking about Australia, I will be talking about Europe, I will be talking about Latin America. As I said, the challenges essentially grow out of a world that is changing. We are facing many alternatives in the power system expansion with growing innovations in supply, in transport, and in demand. Increasing penetration of renewables. Smart grid technologies, flexibilizing system and system operation. Storage technologies being developed, still expensive, but clearly on a downward trend. Demand response. Demand so far in Brazil and Chile, we think it's a given load that you have to supply by all means. Well, demand is reacting and is finding opportunities to couple with system operation. Distributed resources are now competing with central station generation. Gas electricity interactions that I mentioned. And of course, all these coupled that governments are trying to cope with promoting expansion, promoting investment, and therefore looking for alternative policies and regulatory approaches. And of course, in all this process, the central stations are also becoming more efficient and less pollutant, less emission of CO2. But in the center of the discussion is the prosumer. What is the prosumer? The producer and the consumer together. The prosumer that is in a farm using photovoltaic panels to generate part of its own energy. And essentially being able to choose between utility supply, self-supply, or a combination of the two. All these changes, all these technological developments are really menacing the traditional utility business models as we know them. For a start, we don't need that much transportation through wires. Part of the energy can be generated locally. Part of the energy can be stored locally. Spot prices. In the north of Chile, spot prices have gone down to zero because there is excessive solar and wind generation. So they are deflating the spot prices in several parts of the market. And some of the generators are selling their energy on the spot market and facing zero revenues. So there is a revenue risk of traditional central generation. On the other hand, there are new market products and services. Frequency regulation today cannot only be provided by a synchronous generator, but it can be provided by the storage. It can be provided by other technological solutions. So there is competition on service provision. But of course, part of the renewables in many parts of the world, particularly in Europe, in Spain and Germany, have developed through out-of-the-market financing tools. Essentially, they have required subsidies, tax credits, and in-feed tariffs. but that has been, I would argue, part of the past. We already have competing solar technologies. We already have competing wind technologies. So the challenge we face is how do we adapt business models and wholesale market structures to this new environment. Let's go one at a time. Renewable generation. There is a wide-scale global adoption of renewable generation, and we heard this morning a talk on Europe. The European Union, as it was explained this morning, mandates that at least 20% of total energy consumption come from renewables by 2020. And there are countries that are more aggressive. Germany plans for 2030 to generate 50% of its electricity supply with renewable resources, of course, including large hydro. And the case I want to analyze with you is the case of California. It's an article in that magazine that I mentioned. California Governor Jerry Brown set a goal of deriving 50% of electricity from renewable sources by 2030. That is almost tomorrow, and they want 50% of California generation coming from that. Well, why is that taking place? Well, there are advantages. There are no fuel costs. You can have solar generation at the utility size with large fields of PVs or small home roof generation. There's been a dramatic reduction of per kilowatt hour and kilowatt investment in solar energy. There is an incredible learning rate. The future costs by 2030, by all means, and maybe earlier, are comparable to the traditional coal or gas generation. Although today they need subsidies or credit, but the future is clearly one of competing at the same level. Of course, renewables create significant operational challenges, and I will share you the description of the duct chart in California. And, of course, distributed generation, upsetting, again, the utility wholesale model. So that is relation to solar. But wind in particular, which is of interest in Brazil, is also reducing investment costs, growing reliability, and increasing its market share. But of course, the problem with wind is always far away. It needs significant transmission expansion, and I will mention the UK and the Brazil as examples of that taking place. You have your wind in the extreme northeast and in the extreme south, so you really need transmission to bring that energy to the load centers. Well, what are the challenges of renewable generation? First, variability. Therefore, it needs balancing services. Uncertainty of the future output. You don't know exactly when and how you will have the energy you desire. And of course, you have time concentration. Only generation at certain hours of the day, and not 24 hours, 7 days a week. So California is facing severe challenges on that objective of 50%. By 2020, the net load will drop by several thousand megawatts during peak solar production hours. And it will create a very significant output change between 5 and 8 o'clock in the evening. The duct chart. That is the duct chart. What do we have there? Essentially, you have the load here, 2013, like that, with a peak load in the evening. And then we start, as solar generation comes in, we start reducing the load. So we talk about net load, and it goes down, and by 2020, the load discounted the solar generation will be like that. So you have a significant drop in load, but mostly a significant increase in these hours. You will have 11,000, 23,000, you'll have almost 12,000 megawatts that you have to change in generation in a few hours. Of course, there are alternatives. I can drop part of the load in the evening, or I can drop part of the generation during the day and not use all the solar generation, or drop some of the load in the evening. But of course, that has cost. If you cut load, you are talking about $5,000 to $50,000 per megawatt hour of energy non-supplied. If you cut generation, of course you will always have to comply with the standards of renewable energy. So you may have costs of $50 to $150 per megawatt hour. So what is California looking for solutions? For a start, something that was mentioned early this morning also, look around. In our case, look at the countries around. In the case of California, look at the states around and regionally coordinate with neighboring states so that when you have too much solar generation, you might export it. When you have less, you can import it from others. Well, demand response. If there's too much generation of solar, well, maybe reduce the load and pay the load for that service. Or use energy storage. Again, if you have overgeneration, store that energy to be used later. And of course, diversify your portfolio. Use biomass, use biofuels, use geothermal, that are renewables that do not have this intermittency characteristic. The California impact of renewables is the following. For a start, there is clearly no technical barrier. They can go to a 50% renewables by 2030. The wind and the solar costs will be comparable to traditional generation, but the integration will impact costs. And they have analyzed that there will be rate increases to the final consumer up to 14% of the rates. So of course consumers are not very happy with this more expensive energy. And of course the other conclusion is that solar rooftop generation is going to develop, but it still is more costly than centralized generation. So let's go into distributed generation, another dimension that is really changing our world. The prices are reducing, as mentioned, for solar, for distributed generation. The conventional central station economics are being challenged, and the business models of the distributed distribution companies are also being questioned because now supply is being provided locally. So who is going to pay for the wires? The prosumers are opting for partial self-supply, looking at rates, utility rates, and looking at how they can generate, and they're choosing this alternatively. So utilities are seeing vanishing markets. Markets that were there for supply are suddenly disappearing. And regulated consumers that pay for the assets, for the wires, are not paying anymore. Yet, the prosumer expects the utility to maintain the obligation to serve during self-supply shortages. So they are using part of the benefits, but they don't want to pay for the support. So it's funny, regulated businesses are becoming more risky than unregulated businesses. Of course, in our countries, we haven't seen this distributed generation yet, at least not massive. But we have, in both countries, Brazil and Chile, implemented a net metering law. That's the opening window for that to take place. So let's go to an example that is quoted in that magazine. Australia, thousands, millions of rooftops with solar PV. Actually, they started in 2007 with 8,000 houses having solar rooftop to 1.4 million houses having that. It didn't just take place on its own. There was support for it, but look at the trend, impressive. Maybe the country with the highest percentage of houses having solar tube generation. And of course, why did that take place? Something similar to what is taking place in Brazil. Energy prices are going up, and therefore it is attractive to look for alternatives. The PV implementing costs are declining considerably. In Australia, they pay 12 Australian dollars per watt in 2008, and that has been divided by 6. They only pay 2 today. But of course, it didn't take place on its own. There were capital subsidies and there were production subsidies. So what has been the results of that expansion? A reduction of network losses, and an augmentation of network capacity. There is more capacity on the network now that some of the load has gone away. There's been a reduction in peak generation by at least 1,000 megawatts. There is a significant impact on wholesale prices in some of the markets. And the investments have been adequate as far as returns to the investors, and of course giving all the support made by the government. It is not clear, though, if less wires are needed, because the peak load generation comes out of the PV usage. It's around or after sunset. And of course, the network revenues, how do you recover network revenues if you have less consumers? Well, you have to increase the payments for distribution. There is no alternative for that. So there are questions arising from those developments. A concept that was mentioned this morning, the death spiral. You have a declining demand for grid supply electricity. Therefore, you have to pay more for it. And then you have a higher demand reduction, and so forth. So the question is centrally dispatched model in a death spiral? Is traditionally centrally dispatched industry model facing a serious competitive threat for a large segment of the market? The Australian development clearly shows that something is happening there. What regulations should we go for? And on Thursday, there'll be discussions on tariff schemes, and where probably this we analyze. What are the tariff structures? What technologies should we use? What market orientation will have to be followed? Regulators in Australia so far have sided with the network service providers in protecting their monopoly and having their installations and services being paid. But will that be maintained in the future? It's an open question. Storage. That's another new technology that may change the world, and it was also mentioned this morning. There is increasing number of storage technology with important declining storage costs, not as economic today as to support, for example, more distributed generation, but on the trend. Life cycles of storage technologies have improved dramatically as well. And there are storage solutions for distributed generation and storage solutions for the transmission system, for the grid, for generation. There is a broad spectrum of alternatives. As I mentioned, the question now is that the storage comes as a new player. The storage is able to set prices, set energy prices, depending where it's located, set prices for ancillary services, capacity prices, and can provide several other value streams. So it is very relevant that this new player may have an enormous impact on how the market altogether works. Reserve regulation in system operation, which in the past we developed through traditional generation, now can be provided by storage. So it really may change completely the market. Of course, storage is something that we have a lot in Brazil, we have a lot in Chile because of our reservoirs, but it's not present in the US, it's not present in Europe. In the US, actually, the storage technology is being used massively is essentially pumped hydro. It was mentioned as a possibility for Brazil to go into reversible hydro generation. It is the main alternative for energy storage, electricity energy storage. There are, of course, batteries, there is compressed air, which is an important contribution, and there is thermal storage, but the main component is pumped hydro. Well, of course, that is good for enhancing renewable penetration. But the North Americans look at other benefits of energy storage. Grid resilience and reliability, a question that has arisen importantly in the Northern Hemisphere in relation to the climate change, eruptions with major winter problems, with major typhoons and etc. that actually have emphasized the idea that we may have to have a network that is able to operate in different small islands and where storage can play a significant role. And of course, storage also can really bring the benefits of this theoretical smart grid that we're talking will develop in the future. As it was mentioned earlier, we don't have problems with storage. We have hydro. You have important capability of hydro reservoirs in Brazil. We have important hydro generation reservoirs in Chile. But of course, the future doesn't look as good. We are having trouble with building reservoirs. Run of river is the trend. We may not be able to to build large extension reservoirs because of environmental, because of indigenous population reactions. In spite of that, you'd be surprised that in Chile, Chile that has a lot of hydro in the south, is building a pump storage plant in the north of the country. You would say, how would you build one in the area where it's only desert and sea? Well, essentially like that. You have the sea here. You have some areas up in the mountains, up in the hills, I'm sorry, where you could build reservoirs. And actually their project, which is a 300 megawatt pump storage project in the north, is going to pump water from the sea, store it at the top, and then during the night bring it down to replace missing solar generation. And it will be a couple hybrid photovoltaic pump storage generation institution. But of course, reservoirs are good for responding to fluctuations of renewables. But if we need grid storage to give more flexibility to system operation, they are not enough. If we need distributed generation for line congestion management and line loss by moving electricity at off-peak times, then that storage is not adequate. So we are really looking, in spite of our reservoir storage, for the opportunities that new technologies bring us to us. Another dimension, demand response. In Chile, I programmed the operation for the following day, given a certain demand. It never goes through my mind that that demand may change because of prices. On the long term, yes, prices will affect the consumption, but for tomorrow, no, I have to plan just for the demand. I will have to generate for that demand. And of course, that is not what is taking place in Europe or in North America. Demand response tools for system operation, for coping with these technologies that are changeable, are in the field. They benefit customers, they benefit the market, they benefit reliability. But of course, demand response has to be coupled with the price sensitivity and price signals, and that's what we don't have in our countries. And of course, demand response impacts the spot prices. If you had a demand response in Brazil over the last crisis, probably you wouldn't have faced the same peaking prices that you have seen. But of course, demand response can challenge the transmission expansion process. If we have demand response, maybe you don't need some of the lines, because demand response will be able to cope with some of the challenges of peaking energy. As I said, you had a supply crisis these last 2 years. If you had a better demand response, maybe you could have coped better with it. But of course, we don't have price signals for consumer users. We don't have price-based response. We don't have incentive-based response. And it could help. We did an exercise at SISTEP in which we took some of the mining industry in the north, and we looked at their production processes and looked at where they could respond. And of course, there are different dimensions of demand response. This is a graph from the US Department of Energy, price-based demand response, incentive-based demand response. And clearly, the price-based demand response it's not feasible in Chile. The contracts don't have real-time pricing schemes. They have a constant price over time, so there's not much opportunity to respond to that. But in relation to the day ahead or month ahead operational planning, maybe they could work. It could work. Not on the day ahead or the minute ahead, because it really interrupts mining operations, but maybe on the day ahead or the month ahead, it could actually work. And what we did was make an exercise, a simulation exercise, in which we said, okay, let's assume that the generators not wanting to face high spot prices to pay for energy to be provided to the mining industry would pay $70 per megawatt hour to the mining industry that reduces consumption from one day to the other. And there are significant amounts of revenues that could be collected by the mining industry without actually changing its mining output. We're talking about an average revenues of about $10 million that could be collected by these companies. Transmission challenges. Renewable development is forcing the building of new corridors to supply that energy. The UK, I will explain the example, Brazil with its wind far away in the north, actually demanding new transmission corridors. The question arises on who benefits by those corridors, the generator or the consumer? And that is a discussion that is always on the table. Who has to pay for expansion? Who has to pay for transmission? But of course, now we have new elements. Demand response can compete with transmission, energy efficiency, distributed generation, energy storage, and others now can compete with transmission. So how do we plan for transmission when you have all these other dimensions? Nowadays, we clearly are not taking them into consideration, but should we in the future? Should we combine gas distribution with local generation, with distributed generation, and replace that transmission lines? Many open questions. You have significant transmission challenges in Brazil. Your main renewable energy is far from the large consumer centers, and therefore you have had to have huge investments in transmission capabilities. And the potential, as it was explained this morning, for wind, for solar, particularly for wind and hydroelectric, is located far away. And actually there is a potential there is a development of 10 gigawatt wind for 2016 already, but you have significant other resources in the north. According to the Centro Brasileiro de Energia Eólica, there are 75 gigawatt on the northeast of the country, and there are 23 gigawatt on the extreme south of the country. You clearly are in need for transmission. The transmission challenges in the UK are similar. They have significant offshore potential of wind energy in the North Sea. They have significant opportunities to interconnect with the rest of Europe in using these resources. So how do we go about in that? What do we do? The investment projected for that transmission to actually obtain that energy that is located offshore is between 20 to 50 billion pounds in the next decade. So it is clearly there is the need for efficient use of the transmission and efficient and timely transmission investment. And of course, the UK considers very relevant to have adequate transmission signals to all the players in the market. So they looked for mechanisms to see how the cost of transmission would affect generation location, and essentially they look for alternatives to give clear prices to price signals to investors. And finally, they were worried that depending on the pricing scheme, consumer prices may go up or not if inefficient transmission expansion takes place. So at the end, they concluded to maintain their existing long-term locational pricing for transmission payments, which, as you see in the UK, depending on where you are, you pay for transmission. It's interesting that while the locational signal for transmission expansion is geographically, Chile, which traditionally has something like that, is going for a different change. The Chileans just presented a new law this last week, and today it was being presented in Congress by the Minister of Energy, a new law that changes the transmission remuneration and expansion. Essentially, the conclusions were that the locational signals being provided by transmission payments did not impact the decision on where to locate. There were other variables that were more relevant. On the other hand, it concluded that transmission charges were too complex and they were implying an important risk for investors, because you pay for a transmission a certain amount, but you didn't know what you will be paying in 5 years or in 10 years, depending on transmission expansion. So all the uncertainties and risks of transmission payments are being transferred to final consumers, and consumers are paying more for transmission than they should. On the other hand, transmission expansion is being opposed by generators, because whenever there is a transmission expansion, generators have to pay more for it. So the conclusion of the Chilean regulator is that the beneficiaries of the transmission expansion are the consumers, and therefore it is them that have to be paid for the transmission expansion in a postage stamp approach. Quite a different conclusion to what the UK regulator did. The other concept that developed in Chile is that there are different parts of the country, given our geography, where multiple generators could unite, could combine, and build the transmission lines to connect them to the main network. So that, the concept of poles of development is included in the law, and the Ministry of Energy will be looking at where are the opportunities that provide competitive energy and that could be connected and supported by the consumers to connect to the network. Gas availability, increasing dependence of the power sector. The North American shale gas is creating a revolution worldwide. It's creating a revolution in the United States, changing its consumer market, but it's also, once they start exporting, probably creating a change worldwide. We have significant shale gas reserves in South America, particularly in Argentina. Actually, if you look, United States as important shale gas, China, Iran, but one of the most important in relation to conventional and non-conventional, unconventional, is Argentina. So that we really have opportunities for gas to be a major player in our region in the future. The question is, how do we change from the present generation? It was discussed this morning. They spoke about Brazil developing hydro, and then a stage in which you have to go into thermal generation. Coal could be an alternative, natural gas could be an alternative. Of course, natural gas has a better environmental compliance. And therefore, we need a very close coordination between gas and electricity markets. And particularly the problem in Brazil and Chile is, how do we go about with gas and electricity coupling adequately, particularly in a world where, if you want to get reasonable prices for gas, you have to get very long-term take-or-pay contracts. So in the Chilean case, we had a problem, and proposals have been made but not yet implemented. And the problem essentially is that the dispatch cost, the dispatch made by the system operator only considered audited variable costs of fuels. It didn't consider how much gas there was, what would be the possibilities of combining the gas with hydro generation. So it was the way the system is operated is incompatible with the use of contracted gas. And the question that generators always are asked, what cost should I declare? Should I declare an average cost of the gas being paid through, or should I declare a zero cost if I have too much gas and I have to use it? So important contract information in the use of gas is not used. And of course, if you have hydrological uncertainties, it becomes a problem. How do you really go about making hydrological uncertainty talk with take-or-pay contracts? And in the case in Chile has been that we have installed capacity with gas and we don't use it. This is not use capacity of our installations. Look, increasing not use of combined cycle plants that are dual, that could use gas, and instead are burning diesel, increasing the prices. So the proposal made by the University of Chile in a study they performed is to really include the gas economics in the system operation. Something similar like the solution you have in Brazil, in which you have a virtual store, but going further. The problem with your virtual store of energy in reservoirs, gas energy stored in reservoirs, is that only looks on the very short term, and you are buying gas on the spot market, which of course is more expensive. The idea here is to go into a more longer process in which there is also a complementary compensation mechanism. We conclude that there will be more gas imported and prices would go down. And essentially, the proposal has a competitive action of take-or-pay contracts that actually commits all the participants in the market for a good use of gas, of natural gas. Let me finalize by talking at the last but not least important issue in our system expansion, and those are social issues. At least in Chile, we have had a history of problems. As early as 1997, we had significant conflicts in a power plant, a reservoir plant of only 690 megawatts, but was being built in an indigenous community. You had significant conflicts, and the plant was finally built, but it really took more years than expected. We had significant complaints for reservoirs in Patagonia. We were going to build only 2,700 peanuts for Brazil in Patagonia with a project called Hidroaicén. Look, this is the main avenue in Santiago. More people than last Sunday. Incredible, and it finally was a stop. It was not politically feasible. The environmentalist groups actually opposed the building of that and were successful in convincing the country that we were going to flood Patagonia with these reservoirs. And it was finally stopped by this government a year ago. But it's not only home that we have the problems. Belo Monte. Of course, we're talking about 11,000 megawatts, but clearly severe conflicts with the indigenous population. How do we go about that? If we don't solve that, we won't have more energy. We lose the time discussing about technologies. Should we use gas? Should we use coal? In Chile, not only hydro is being opposed, coal is also very strongly being opposed. So how do we go about? I had the honor of participating in a committee that has been working for about 6 months in looking at the future of energy in Chile by 2050. And we analyzed all the dimensions of the problem. And one of the dimensions of the problems were the social and environmental challenges. And we agree on a discussion of different people that there should be some principles, some basic principles in energy development in relation to the society and the environment. First, you have to really reconcile national and regional interests in energy development, because not all regions may agree on what is being built in their areas. There is clearly the need to respect the public good in general. And, of course, it has to be equitable. You build Ralco, the first plant that I showed you that was opposed. You have 6,000 workers coming to the location. They stay for about 2, 3 years, 4 years. A lot of economic development. The plant is built. The workers go away. 2 or 3 system operators remain, and nothing else remains. The local community remains as poor as it was before. No change in their lives. So, and all this energy is going to the metropolis. It's going to the mining industry, to the industry. And what about the local community? So we are also thinking that in the process of convincing communities, we have to find that this is equitable. What do we mean by that? That it's able to facilitate that energy development favors local development, defined by the communities, indigenous and non-indigenous, creating institutional mechanisms to facilitate an equitable distribution of costs and benefits associated with energy development throughout the country. We went one further. We just proposed a law, a change of law to the Congress, in which we are going to increase the energy rates for people that live in the cities, in very dense communities and decrease the rates, electricity rates paid by consumers in these very high generation areas. Depending on how many megawatts are installed in the area, they will have more reduction in their energy. So they at least see a first benefit in that direction. But the idea is to go even further, to really promote economic growth in a country which has important wealth differences. So, to close my presentation and leave at least 10 minutes for questions, clearly many challenges await for us. There are opportunities for growth, there are opportunities for new technologies, but of course there are threats of destruction of the world we know. And of course our countries must prepare in different dimensions, technical, economical, and regulatory. Particularly in Brazil, where a lot of discussion takes place on regulation, this is a challenge, how our regulation should evolve and prepare for that future. And of course, the social dimension will be fundamental. And at the end, of course, the main goal that we all share is that we want to achieve a sustainable, economic, and reliable energy and electricity supply. Thank you very much.
Professor Rudnick, thank you very much. When Richard Hosteller from our team suggested your name, it was immediately the acceptance. I think that what you provided here more than justifies that. Thank you very much. Time for a few questions. Temos tempo para algumas perguntas. Já que o senhor tocou no tema, aqui no final, sobre a expansão. By the way, eu sei que o senhor entende bem português. Já que o senhor tocou no tema sobre a expansão da oferta de energia, principalmente nas regiões amazônicas, lá com problemas de convulsões sociais ou questões indígenas, etc. É sobre isso que eu quero fazer. A minha pergunta, o free prior, informed free prior consent, né, partindo de populações indígenas. Esse é um assunto que aqui no Brasil ainda não foi regulamentado, como até já foi mencionado. Né? Enfim, a questão indígena tem sido foco de conflitos, sem que se enxergue com clareza um caminho em que os problemas possam ser resolvidos e equacionados. O senhor tem uma recomendação especial sobre como se tratar desse tema?
The question is, and this has been a heated question in Chile over the last 6 months in this committee I mentioned to you, is do you give the regions, do you give the locals the right to decide if generation takes place there or not? How binding is that decision? And it is the answer is not evident. We must look for national energy objectives. We must assess what are the real avenues of development that will benefit our society as a whole. And if in those analyses you conclude that you need a 4,000 kilometer transmission line, or you need to build a huge hydro plant near an indigenous area, you should go with it. But look to the community for alternatives. We are now having problems with the line, transmission line that is being built from Santiago to the north of Chile by a Colombian company. And essentially the way our regulation works is that you define an expansion line, you call for an auction for who builds that line, and then you tell the winner, you have to build this line from here to there. And of course, it wants to minimize costs. It wants to find a solution to build the line within a very limited time frame. But it doesn't look for alternatives. We should come early into the communities and ask them to help us find alternatives. For transmission line, clearly, there are alternative paths. You cannot ask for transmission to be underground, it would be too expensive, but maybe bring it otherwise in other areas. The question is more difficult for a generation plant because those are very heavily located, decided on location. But then you have to consult the community, you have to look for opportunities for them to get involved. There are examples in New Zealand, examples in Switzerland, where the local communities are partly owners of those plants and get immense benefits from their developments. Some people criticize that because they say you are bribing the community. It's not bribing the community, it's giving them opportunities for development. I think all those alternatives have to be tried. Whether they work for a community, an indigenous community in the Amazon that wants their environment not to be changed at all, it's of course if it causes an additional difficulty. But I think we clearly have understood that the model of the past, in which the central government defines whatever without citizen participation or citizen or society benefits, is something of the past.
Ok, temos uma pergunta lá atrás.
Boa tarde, parabéns pela apresentação, professor. Pode ser em português mesmo, né? Ok.
Devagado.
Perfeito. No Brasil, hoje, o marco regulatório, a regulação do setor, ela aloca todo o risco de mercado nas distribuidoras. Nesse sentido, quanto maior o mercado da distribuidora, quanto mais energia ela distribui, maior é a sua receita e maior é a sua lucratividade. Por outro lado, esse mesmo marco regulatório, ele incentiva e, inclusive, legalmente obriga as distribuidoras a investirem tanto em eficiência energética quanto em geração distribuída. Sendo que tanto a expansão dessas atividades, tanto eficiência energética quanto geração distribuída, acaba por reduzir o mercado, a receita e a lucratividade dessas empresas. Isso acaba gerando um sinal econômico contraditório para o agente. A minha pergunta é, nesses países em que houve uma expansão grande da geração distribuída e da eficiência energética, como a Austrália, a Califórnia, como que eles lidaram com esse impasse, com essa contradição de sinal econômico?
Okay, I understood most of your question, but Michael Pollitt on Thursday will be discussing the issue of distribution rates and distribution regulation. But clearly, in Australia at least, they haven't changed the regulator hasn't changed is mind. Essentially, the transmission wires have to be paid, and I assume they are asking the distribution company to be efficient. They have fixed rates based on an efficient building of the distribution and efficient management of the company. Therefore, the risk is essentially for them to be able to be as efficient as the government defines. But given that, they're being assured the payment by the consumers. And essentially, what happens then is that as less consumers are paying for distribution, depending on how you charge. If you charge depending on the energy use, of course, you will get less revenues from consumers. And essentially, that implies that you will have to raise the rates in future rate definitions. But in essence, transmission and distribution being monopolistic activities regulated by the government, efficiently regulated, with benchmarks that actually ask them to be efficient, should have no risk, and therefore should have smaller rates of returns, of course. The risk is essentially at the generators level. That is where it should be, and where competition should take place and bring us more economic energy.
Ok, mais alguém? Tem alguma questão, alguma pergunta? Não? Nós agradecemos então.
Thank you for the invitation.
Agradecemos ao Sr. Hugh pela sua apresentação.